Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us and this conversation on building resilience in children during a pandemic. My name is Joe Primo, and I'm the CEO of Good Grief. And I want to start this conversation today by acknowledging all the ways in which these uncertain times during COVID-19 can be hard and scary for kids, but also equally as scary for parents to parent. The point of this webinar is to build resilience in children and help strengthen families on a day to day basis as a result of COVID 19's disruption to our lives and our exposure to so much anxiety and grief. As kids are hearing stories about death on the news, have their routines drastically altered, and find themselves cooped up in the house, many kids are worried that they or the people they love will die. And we're going to take on that topic in our next webinar because first, we have to build a foundation on how to talk about challenging adversities, since that is a skill that many people don't possess. And I think it's important to note that this reality is no one's fault because these lack of skills and resources around these conversations can really be understood as symptoms of our culture, which is one that in normal conditions tends to avoid or distance itself from the tough conversations and aspects of life. So, unfortunately, this reality comes at a cost to children facing adversity. And that cost to children is really what I want to focus on and what we're going to take on head on today by giving you really some new ways of thinking about and building resilience in children. We're going to make some critical paradigm shifts from a culture that thinks its job is to protect children to a culture that is focused on engaging the realities of life by empowering children. And before I can begin laying out our other goals for today, I believe it's important to name that we adults need to challenge ourselves by committing to becoming better at naming and both exploring our own fears and whatever resistance we may have to the tough realities of life. Because in the larger scheme of things, I think a lot of the dysfunction the next generation inherits is the result of our own discomfort around critical topics. And this here is our chance to break the cycle that we inherited in this conversation today. I'm going to share the good grief model and philosophy with you because this is a great framework for how we should be thinking about and responding to the emotional needs of children. I'm going to briefly lift up the work that we do here at Good Grief, since I think our work exemplifies how to build resilience in children and families as a result of the fact that each and every day we are interacting with kids who have endured really the unimaginable. They've experienced the death of a mom, a dad, a sister, or brother. And all of these children have taught and shown us the importance of effectively communicating with kids. And from all of these kids, I've also learned that hope is always lingering on the horizon. We just have to know how to look for it. Just really quickly, for those of you who are new to us, Good Grief provides free programs to children and families after the death of a family member at our family support centers and satellites. And additionally, we provide our Good Grief Schools program to any school looking to teach resilience to students grades K through 12. Within that program, we provide peer support groups to grieving students and also parent and professional education. So, at the heart of our mission, we are really empowering individuals and communities to build resilience and cope through loss and adversity. So let's get going with our goals today. They're simple but critical. First, we need to check in with ourselves. We have some reflection points from the adult's perspective. Second, we want to understand why grief is good and why we should embrace it in these times. Next, grief needs to be integrated into our lives. Resilience is built, and kids need responsive adults to become more resilient. I want to set the tone for these goals in this conversation with a quote from Alan de Botton in the foreword to a book called The School of Life. He said, "We reliably educate pilots and neurosurgeons, actuaries and dental hygienists. We offer lessons and textbooks on the conductive properties of metal alloys. Yet, what is distinctive is just how selective we are about the topics we deem it possible to educate ourselves in. Our energies are overwhelmingly directed toward material, scientific, and technical subjects and away from psychological and emotional ones. Much anxiety surrounds the question of how good the next generation will be at math, very little around their abilities at marriage or kindness. We devote inordinate hours to learning about tectonic plates and cloud formations, and relatively few fathoming shame and rage." For me, this quote speaks rather deeply. I'm not a silver linings kind of guy, but as I reflect on this pandemic, I believe we are faced with an opportunity to make good choices about how to teach and parent through this adversity. As adults, we know and have likely experienced the frequent intolerability that life can provide. And so here we are in the throes of COVID-19, and we are faced with some really important and critical questions. The first, how do we want to parent? How can we foster healthy communication? How can we develop healthy coping strategies in kids? And how can we teach wisdom to children instead of fear? Uh, these questions might feel a little existential or angsty to you, but think about this paradigm shift that I'm proposing, that this is a time of fear and uncertainty that can become a time of building resilience and making meaning out of our shared lives and losses. If we adults want to know how to be helpful to children, then we have to be grounded in our goals and also our hopes for children. And for me personally, my goal is to make sure kids have the resources they need in order to confront this adversity, but also future adversities. Ultimately, the skills that a child develops during this time, those are skills that are going to serve them for the rest of their lives. So, making the decision to engage adversity is a choice on how we want our children to emerge when this is over. And before being able to speak about what children need, I think we really need to shift our mindset. In order for us to evolve our thinking on grief and adversity, I want to propose a paradigm shift that might seem outrageous at face value. And it's simply this: grief is good. If we change how we look at grief, we can change how we respond to grief. So let's start. What is grief? Well, grief is a series of responses and reactions to losing something. And that something can be a person, our identity, our sense of safety, our perspective on the world, or even the order of the world. So, yes, what many of us are feeling during this pandemic is, in fact, grief. But grief is something that every human since the beginning of time has experienced. It's this universal experience that exists across every culture, demographic, and really all of time. And the thing is, it doesn't exist for nothing. It serves an inherent purpose. And I believe that that purpose is to forge a new identity and a new perspective. So that means that grief is a tool and that it is doing work within us. And while grief can be a very hard and difficult experience and prompt all sorts of feelings and questions, and these are feelings and questions that we may very well like to avoid, grief is the catalyst to moving us forward with our lives. It's ultimately the thing that helps us keep on keeping on. And I would strongly argue that grief is what caused many passengers on the plane that Sully landed on the Hudson River to quit their jobs and their relationships, just like happened after 9/11, and what happens every single day when someone comes back from a life threatening illness or experience. That's because grief can be a wake up call. It can be the resource that helps you find your way forward, and it can be the tool that helps you find meaning and purpose. So, in other words, grief is not just some dreaded experience that lurks in the shadows and just hangs around waiting to taunt and ruin your life, even though in the throes of it, it might feel that way. Ultimately, grief is good because it helps us forge a new identity at different transitions in our lives. That is, it's a sort of guidepost for shaping our perspective, both on the world and also on ourselves. And while it is this tool that moves us through our grief, through our pain, through the experience, it also leaves something behind, oftentimes in the form of us developing our values or priorities in life. So as we as we think about this paradigm shift in the time of a pandemic, we need to ask ourselves what our emotional response to COVID-19 is doing for us and what it is doing to us. I think one theme that has emerged for so many of us is our interconnectedness. And what does this awareness do to our worldview and our values as we come to appreciate and acknowledge this interconnectedness? And how does this impact how we want to parent and interact with our children? So, our awareness of this interconnectedness is heightened. And now we can ask ourselves, well, what are we going to do to parent now that we have this increased awareness? I think one of the other things coming out of this is that the pandemic has shown us that we need heroes to go to work at the hospital and to care for us. We need heroes to show up at the grocery store so that we can have food. And we need each other in all aspects of life so that we can endure adversity together. The endurance of adversity is not a solitary act, it's a communal act. And I think one of the reasons why I have been, and why I think so many other people are moved by these by terrible stories with kind actions, um, is because I think about several examples when I've been trolling social media and watch videos like that of the Berkeley School of Music students. They were jamming out to what the world needs now, and I felt filled with hope. I was full of joy watching people clap for hospital workers because my dad's a nurse and still working, even though he's in a vulnerable demographic. So there are these stories, these positive stories that confront my fear with joy. And that willingness to be confronted with that joy, that is part of the grief is good mindset. Because when we're open to and can see our interconnectedness and our codependency on each other, then this openness shifts our worldview. Grief helps us see the goodness that also accompanies the hardship. So, in order for grief to be good, we need to embrace it by integrating it into our lives rather than trying to stuff it into some heavy duty box that we can put an impenetrable lock on and we can just hide it in the closet. So, to help you better understand my point, I want to share the good grief philosophy with you. The graphic that we're using here, we designed it to look this way quite intentionally because grief is not a linear process. There are no stages. Grief is not something that um, it because it's not linear. It's something that you can move in and out of, and it is circular and cyclical. And just when we think we've arrived at the other side, a trigger can bring us back. And this can be true not just when we experience the death or loss of somebody, but this is also true during a pandemic. Just when we think we've got a handle on our fears, we may find ourselves blue and unable to concentrate or get out of bed. That might be because we read an article, watched a press conference, binged Tiger King too much on Netflix, felt the walls closing in on us while stuck at home. And then there's just this immobilizing fear. And that is okay and normal. And here's the thing, kids are going to find themselves in the same cycles, though they may express it differently. So, my point here is that we shouldn't be deceived into thinking that life or any of its adversities are a linear process because there are no stages. So, as we look at this image of the good grief philosophy, we see that engaging our fears, anxieties, and feelings can lead to a reinvestment in life. Our goal here isn't to enter into a land of make believe, but rather to look the monster straight in the eyes. We need to be able to respond to our anxiety and fear by saying, I see you, as it pokes its head from the pit of our stomachs. And then to embrace it, we got to lean straight in and give it a big hug. I see you, followed by I got you, and I'm not going to let you run amok unsupervised. And that might sound easy or maybe a little wacky, but have you ever tried to catch a dragon or jump on a moving train? Because sometimes engaging and embracing can only get as far as our ability to acknowledge, just the acknowledgement that the feeling exists in the first place. And when we practice acknowledging feelings as adults, we're able to be more responsive to kids because we know that this takes work. So, by practicing this for ourselves, we also learn what type of questions to ask a child while also now having the personal experience, having done it ourselves, to provide tips from firsthand experience. So, now that we've caught the pesky dragon, hopefully we can be better able to help a child do the same. So here comes our hypothetical child, which I have named little Howard. Super cute. But here's the thing, he's cranky that he can't see his friends. He's cranky that he doesn't get to leave the house. He's cranky that he isn't getting affirmation from his teachers for being the best student in the class. He's worried that grandpa is going to die from COVID-19, whose silly name he doesn't even understand. And he's cranky because he's stuck with you all day. And face it, mom, you're just not as cool as little Howie's friends. Little Howie is hurting. So, where do we begin helping him catch that dragon and tame it? First, we need to name it. Howie, you don't seem like yourself. And little Howard's response is going to be completely unique to him. Maybe he can articulate that he's worried about grandpa or cranky about not seeing his friends. Maybe he can't articulate this, and maybe he just has that cranky feeling filling his whole entire body. In order for a kid to work through their feelings, they're going to need some critical ingredients. So here they come. First, Kids need honesty. Because guess what? No kid ever grows up to say, hey, thanks for lying to me. I found that super helpful. Unfortunately, stating the facts at this time can be really hard. As the pandemic was breaking, we all know that there was all sorts of conflicting information, and the general public wasn't sure of what was happening. And on top of that, we still have no timeline for knowing how this is going to play out. And all of that makes honesty challenging, but not impossible because it is okay to say, I don't know, but then follow up that I don't know with, I will tell you as soon as I do know. And be sure to keep that commitment because honesty isn't about having every answer. As adults, we know that life does not work that way. The dictionary says honesty is free of deceit and untruthfulness. It's sincerity. In other words, don't try to deceive a child. That is not helpful. As as we're facing an adversity like COVID-19, kids need facts. Facts help us process what's happening while helping us make sense out of the current situation. And when we're not honest with children, they will fill in the blanks and construct their own narrative, which is often much worse than reality. Without facts, a child may quickly conclude that we are on the verge of a zombie apocalypse. And that's arguably a heck of a lot scarier than the significant challenge we are currently up against. When thinking about facts, a child doesn't need to know every detail when giving them facts, just the main points that help them understand. Because facts paired with honest answers to every question, that's a key ingredient, right? That combo right there, that's real chemistry. Being honest with kids, it's not about waking a kid up every morning, fixing breakfast, and saying, here's how many new infections and deaths that occurred overnight, little Howie. When a kid has honest facts, they can begin understanding the reality that they now live in. This is the beginning of them being able to integrate this new reality into their thinking, their feeling, and their perceiving. And if a child is empowered with facts, they are also empowered to explore their questions and feelings and to continue living their life despite the fear or uncertainty. In other words, they can reinvest in life rather than retreat from it. So let's go back to little Howie for a second. If we give him facts without any deceit, he's going to be able to use the facts as tools to help him understand. He will be able to do the work that is required to process this pandemic and then have a perspective on it. He's also going to be able to follow up with questions while trusting that he's going to receive a real answer, which will further enrich his understanding. And that there brings us to the next goal for today, which is understanding the role of resilience. As much as some folks wish this was otherwise, children are not born with a bundle of resilience. And sure, physiologically, babies are born resilient, but we are talking about the emotional health of children. And resilience, ultimately, it is a muscle and it needs to be trained. So we don't get buff, do we, just by thinking about it? I spend a lot of time thinking about it, but it doesn't happen because the only way that we're going to get buff is by actually going to the gym and training. The same thing is true for resilience. During this pandemic and disruptions to our life, I think we need to be grounded in a shared goal of building resilience in children because that ultimately is the antidote for facing all sorts of adversity. It's going to be important for us to remember that resilience is not an autonomous thing. It's a compilation of attributes or parts that comprise the collective whole, and these parts are what build resilience, which is to say, while you're stuck at home living off of your rations, and hopefully that's not going too poorly for you, you're not going to succeed at making chili by dumping dry kidney beans in a bowl with a little bit of water and then saying, "Hey kids, look, we got chili," because you forgot all the other beans, the seasoning, the broth, the tomatoes, and you didn't even cook the thing, right? So resilience is the formation of coping skills, which comprises all these other many parts. And I think when it comes to kids in particular, we very much and very often forget their need to know that they matter. Little Howie may have been cranky because when he was at school, he gets affirmation from his teachers, and that helps him feel important and like he matters. Now he's stuck at home and he's just not getting that same sort of response. And as adults, we spend a lot of time telling kids how to see the world and respond to it rather than facilitating their way through it. As a result of this common way of parenting, we can easily forget that the truth of the matter is children have rich inner lives in which they are exploring their world and trying to understand it. And when we help a child see and actually experience that they matter, then their sense of self emerges. Here at Good Grief, we hear and know all sorts of stories, many of which are messy and complicated because death is seldom neat or tidy. To give you an example, when working with kids, our goal is not to cross reference a child's story and perception with their parent's version of the story, right? So a kid tells a story, we don't go running off to the parent and say, "Hey, did this happen?" We wouldn't go to mom and say, "Hey, mom, just to be clear, when dad was dying, did he or didn't he levitate just moments before dying because your kid just said he did?" And yes, this is a true story. One little guy told his group that moments before dad died, he started to float through the room. In order to build this little guy's resilience, our goal wasn't to be like, "Hey, guy, I don't think that happened, and we just talked to your mom, and she says you're a big liar." Instead, we want to unpack that story with him. Was he trying to get attention? I don't even know what that means, but just put that out there as a question. Because ultimately, beneath his story is likely something else, like wanting to have the most special and amazing dad that ever existed. Or maybe he wanted to take a terribly painful moment and make it an exciting one where with the suspense of his dad's final actions, they were this mind-blowing levitation. Or maybe the nurse was moving dad with a hospital lift and the little guy was just narrating it as this great last final move. I don't really know, but if I believe that this child's perception matters and that he matters, I'm going to spend the time exploring this story with him to better understand his perspective and his truth as it currently exists to him. And when taking the time to understand, I also need to take the time to engage. So rather than dismissing the cranky kid who, like you, is crawling out of his skin because quarantines are the worst, we need to be grounded in our goals. Because if we remember, we set out to make kids more resilient and to find ways to make this difficult time a time in which our children emerge more resilient for future adversities. So, when you perceive little Howard as being a cranky pants, you've got an opportunity in front of you to ask some follow up questions. So, hey, little Howie, you don't seem like yourself. I'm wondering what's bothering you. I'm wondering how you're doing today. This pandemic is making me really anxious, little Howie. I'm wondering about you. What would what would you like to do at home today to make today feel less stressful? The child is seen and empowered with these simple open-ended questions. And this sort of engagement and attunement with kids, that's obviously asking a lot of adults. But the way I look at it is that's what distinguishes you from other adults, because this type of adult that you want to be is what we call a responsive adult. And when it comes to the research is entirely clear that when a child faces adversity, the variable that tips a child towards good mental and physical health is a responsive adult. This is the adult that meets that child where they are on this given day, right? Meeting them exactly where they're at, getting down to their level and trying to understand where they are today. I would argue that a responsive adult is not one who is looking to rescue or make the situation better, but rather one who strives to understand a child and provide nurture. We all benefit from nurture, but children in particular benefit from this sort of care because nurture provides gentleness and compassion. And that helps a child know that they're cared for and that they matter. And nurture also fosters safety. Because at the end of the day, we all want to feel safe, especially as a pandemic is on the run. So a child obviously wants to feel very safe. Just take a moment and put yourself in an 8-year old's shoes. As an 8-year old, there is not much that you can control. Instead, you're dependent on an adult to create an environment in which you can explore, play, develop, and express yourself. You're dependent on a child to give you that. You're dependent on an adult as a child to give you that environment. So, safety is not just about physical safety from some sort of bad guy or pandemic. Children need an environment where their emotional safety is also preserved. When they receive this, they can be more open to vulnerability, sharing fears, and asking big questions. And they can do this because they know the adult in their life is going to catch them if the thing they are exploring becomes too big and too scary. But in order to foster this sort of safety and connecting, we need to appreciate that open communication is critical. Safety allows for communication, which allows for vulnerability. And when a child knows they can share their thoughts and feelings without judgment, then they are inclined to share more, which empowers the adult in their life to be more responsive. So, as you can see, all of these things are interconnected, which is why they all matter for building resilience, for training that resilience muscle. And I think one of the last ingredients in this for this context, as it were, is affirmation. In order for a child to know they matter and that their perspective is important, they need to be affirmed rather than dismissed. Right? Go back to that levitation story. Affirm the perspective rather than dismiss it. And here's another simple scenario, which you've probably already faced. So your child says, I saw the news, mommy, and so many people are dying in Italy and China, New York and New Jersey. Are you going to die? Many parents are going to want to dismiss the feeling or perspective by saying, no, 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 that's never going to happen to me. But Children stew on these types of responses. They'll take some time to think about it, and many are just going to conclude, well, hey, if those people can die over there, then why can't I or my mom? And now the child is wondering why mom wasn't honest. And I think ultimately it's only natural that adults want to protect children, but protecting doesn't affirm their feelings or what they are ultimately trying to process. Kids can't be protected from life events because ultimately the truth eventually gets out. So instead, if we're going to be a responsive adult, we have to respond to questions with honesty and even our own vulnerability. And when we do that, I have found that kids will often surprise us. The mummy in this example might be thinking, oh my goodness, he's so terrified he's going to lose me. When in reality, the kid is thinking, who's going to get my ice cream when she's gone? So rather than protecting a child with a dishonest response about how and when you will die, the act of exploring what the child is asking, that is an affirming act in and of itself. So, little Howie, are you afraid that I am going to die? Are you worried about what will happen to you if I die? What do you think happens when someone dies? Right? These are just simple affirmative questions in your efforts to try to understand. And this might be one of the hardest things. Remember that this is about the child and not about you. So if you can get out of the way and create the space and environment for them to share their concerns and thoughts, you will have the information you need in order to better respond with empathy and nurture. And that brings me to my next point about responsive adults. Don't make assumptions. Pretty simple point. You have no idea what a child has heard, what they're thinking, or what they are feeling until they tell you. So, when we create a safe and nurturing environment, generally speaking, a child is likely to share more. When we don't make assumption, a child takes us on their inner journey and welcomes us into their rich inner life. When we are responsive as an adult, and empower a child to tell us more about their fears and their perspective or their thoughts, we're going to be able to be of more help to them because we're starting to see the world through their eyes. And here's the thing, a child's worldview is not just influenced by you or their classmates alone. The news and every online platform impacts these little viewers. The type of information a child is receiving and how that information is being delivered, ultimately that might not be helpful to a kid because these platforms are not thinking of the kids when they push out sensational stories. And yet those stories are everywhere. So there are things you can do to control this narrative. First, monitor TV consumption and don't leave it running in the background. As we've already talked about, provide honest information so that when they hear misinformation or fear based provocations, they are already prepared. Have daily check ins with kids. You can create a check in over dinner, have some open ended prompts, like on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being terrible. How are you feeling about today? If today was a color, what color would it be and why? If today was an animal, what animal would it be and why? Right? These are just a few simple, modest examples that you can build upon. But I think ultimately it's really important to note that as this disruption to a child's routine continues, adults are ultimately going to have to be more creative and responsive. And that's terribly hard because our routines are also disrupted, and we are likely full of anxieties ourselves. But we set out in this conversation with some goals, and we need to come back to our goals. So, who do we want our kids to become as they emerge from this experience? If this moment in time is going to be formative to their education and who they grow up to be, what do we want this to look like on the other side? For me, I would want a child who is able to become comfortable with a boredom, more empathic to those who are ill and scared, and have some coping strategies form for future hardships that inevitably come to every person's life. And I appreciate that staying true to our goals may also feel hard, which is why for kids and adults alike, it's helpful to reinforce and identify those things that we can control. So even the small stuff matters. If a child can control what they want for breakfast, at what time of day they need to make their bed by, right? And you're thinking, lofty idea. If they can control at their ability to still play with toys or watch their favorite shows, these are all areas and things to name as things we can control and things that can move us out of our anxiety and fears, um, regarding all those things that we can't control. So, with everything shared here, and I totally appreciate that it's a lot of information, I think it's important to acknowledge that this is hard work. And that's why being grounded in our goals is so important, because it reminds us to remain steady. None of this information is a one time fix. One time fixes don't exist. Repetition and practice are critical throughout this pandemic, just as in other times in life when a child is facing and trying to work through adversity. For ongoing support, we have additional resources at good-grief.org for communicating with kids around adversity, including a tip sheet that corresponds to everything discussed here. There are a bunch of other tip sheets and resources available on the website. So as we come towards conclusion, I want to recap um, what we set out to do here. First, change our perspective that grief is good because it serves a purpose. So there is something important going on inside of us right now. Honesty and empowerment help a child integrate grief and adversity into their lives. This is about integration and embracing so that we can reinvest. Resilience is built like a muscle, and its many ingredients lead to healthy coping skills. Many different parts, not just one thing. And responsive adults can make all the difference. That's you. So you have really important work to do. I started this webinar asking you to be reflective about your own fears and concerns at this time. And now that we've covered some paradigm shifts and ways in which you can be helpful to children during this pandemic, I want to conclude by asking you to take the teaching points and goals from this presentation and apply them to yourself. When we, the adults, engage and integrate the tough stuff in life, when we do the self care and build our resilience, when we build trusting relationships that support us through our anxiety, we are able to be better present and more responsive to all the children in our lives. Thanks for joining us and for your commitment to the future that we ultimately have in children. Please do visit us at good-grief.org for additional resources, such as tip sheets and other materials on COVID-19. Stay well, be safe, and stay sane.